how much Anavar is safe to use. Now, this kind of feeds back into, where I ended the last answer at, is this comes down to the needs of the athlete, of the division, and their risk tolerance. So in the case where someone is looking to be a high-level competitor in one of the upper divisions, wellness, figure, women's physique, women's bodybuilding, any of the male divisions, we're talking about someone that has accepted some degree of risk, because realistically, there is going to be drug use within all of these divisions. And you could even argue that in a lot of cases, you're going to have individuals who are really pushing that envelope, specifically on the female side. So this kind of plays into a needs analysis specific to the athlete. What's safe to use? Well, the safest is going to be the lowest dose for the lowest duration. So whatever that is relative to the individual's needs. Now, there's sure an intersection where it's okay, this individual might not have the propensity to build as much muscle as they need for said division. So in turn, they're going to have to continue to escalate that dose. But there certainly is a point where it's okay, this is going to have deleterious effects on their systems. It's also just generally not aligned with their risk tolerance. And that's where, from a coaching standpoint and an athlete standpoint, we want to not necessarily run that up initially, because we might find that the individual can get more without having to escalate that dose super high. So within the bikini division, you'll see a lot of people will say, I used 10 milligrams, for the duration of my prep. That was 16 weeks. And then I took a little time off and then got back on cycle because I needed to grow. And my feedback was I need more muscle. And realistically, it's okay, did you need 10 milligrams or would 5 have done the job? And in the case of contest prep, even more so, it's you weren't really driving muscle growth. You were enhancing your training. You were putting yourself in a position where you could train harder, sure. But you had a fuller look, and maybe that allowed you to do a little bit better, but you took it for such a long duration. And what was the cost? Safety profile is largely going to depend on what you deem is important to you to preserve, because with the use of Anavar, with the use of an anabolic, we have to really respect the fact that its intention, it's good at building muscle, but there is androgenic potential. And for each individual, what this means and what this looks like and how this translates at specific doses, that can vary wildly. So we don't want to assume that okay, well, because this athlete took 10 milligrams, and I'm speaking more from the POV of a coach, if this athlete took 10 milligrams, for let's say 15 weeks, and they did really well, and they saw improvements in their physique and they had no side effects, it doesn't necessarily mean that should be the starting dose for all your competitors. Or in the case of the athlete, if you hear your girlfriend took this amount for this long, it doesn't mean that you're going to get the same results. And that's where I would be very cognizant about that, and really understand if someone didn't experience virilization, it doesn't mean that they weren't on a risky cycle. It doesn't mean that their cycle was technically safe, or that their sourcing is the absolute best and is risk-free. It just simply means in that isolation, in that isolated, time frame, they didn't experience virilization. But what you also have to understand is that part of virilization is, potentially seeing clitoral megaly. And that's not really going to be something that most women are going to disclose. I don't know, maybe your girlfriend will share with you. Maybe that's something that, she'll feel comfortable telling you she did experience, but her voice didn't change. Realistically, though, I think it's fair to assume that's something that most people are going to keep private, and they're not going to volunteer that information. And even if you ask, there always is the chance that someone's not being 100% truthful. So I would just really be mindful as to whether or not you have all the information if you are using someone's cycle and then trying to replicate that to yield the same results. Now, the next question that kind of goes hand in hand with this: how long can you use Anavar for? And very similar thought process here. The safest use, or a safer use approach, the approach that's going to protect you the most. I mean, obviously, and this is same conversation as how do you not get pregnant? Well, you don't have sex. Okay. How do you not virilize? You don't use anabolics. You don't put an exogenous anabolic in place, i.e. Anavar. The shortest amount of time that I would use it is 6 weeks in the case that you were trying to yield muscle growth. Now, the shortest amount of time that I would use it in the case that you are intending to improve cosmetically the look that you're bringing to stage, or just your look for like a peaking process. I mean, like theoretically you could use it for just 1, 2, 3 weeks in the case that you were like trying to refine that peak. That's very much been my experience using it. I have used it at the end of contest prep. I've also used it at the beginning. I've found that yes, it can drive the look and create a fuller look. And in that case where it's very understood that like you're not building muscle using it, it makes more sense to only have it in place to drive that cosmetic look. And then once the need is no longer there to peak or to have that look for stage, i.e. like you're getting off stage, post show, you're moving into your off season, well, then it can be removed. And that's where I think some people get tripped up. They're like, well, I was expecting you to say what's the longest that you should use it. And yeah, there is a max duration, but I would say really like on the other end of that spectrum, we have to talk about shorter use cycles and what's the intention, what's the point, and what are the, I really say like goalpost that, you know, will yield desired outcome in that case, like placing better, or in the case of someone using it in the off season, using it for 3-4 weeks. It's like, yeah, you're going to get some training performance, but realistically, like, are you a top Olympian who only needs like, I don't know, 1 or 2 pounds of muscle? And even then, like, do you really want to roll the dice with that short duration of use of like 3-4 weeks? When in reality, like if you're a trained athlete, you're not going to build that much muscle that quickly. So I look at it almost like, okay, the needs of the athlete. If you need a significant amount of muscle, anywhere from 5 to 10 pounds, sure, it can go in. And I would say like the max duration, like 8 weeks in the case of bikini, or in the case of someone who's like, I'm very risk averse. Obviously, you need to monitor for side effects while you are using, and also before, just to ensure that you have that baseline. But even during those 8 weeks, like the amount of muscle that you're going to develop and you're going to grow during that time, it's going to largely depend on how well designed your program actually is. And like once you put Anavar in place, that's going to be the really the telltale is like, okay, are you just like exploding with muscle now? Like, have you really like just sent your progress through the roof? Because that in theory is what should happen if you were already building without it. You should see a huge, like a massive spike in training performance and recovery capacity. And from that, you should be able to build muscle. But again, largely going to come down to, are you in a position where you can build, and are you seeing progress without it? Now, for other divisions, yes, you are going to see cycles that are much, much longer and much more aggressive. But what I would say is that if you are able to grow off 2.5 milligrams, off 5 milligrams, I wouldn't necessarily escalate it because you've now done a cycle. And 2.5 milligrams of Anavar works. It does. It will drive training performance. And sure, you might become accustomed to that drive and training performance, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you need more. It doesn't mean that more is going to yield more muscle growth. Yes, to a certain extent, like more drugs can allow you to unlock potentially more muscle growth, but there are caveats to that. And there's also a ceiling to that on both the male and the female side. And even within that, it's like you have to understand that the higher dose that you take for the extended duration for, you know, a longer period of time, that is ultimately going to increase the probability that you virilize, that you lose that femininity, that you develop masculinization, you develop masculine characteristics. And, you know, ironically, this brings me to my next point. What happens if I use too much Anavar or use it for too long? So globally, what you're going to see is that liver enzymes, they do go up. So ALT, AST, you're going to see some dysregulation. You're going to see HDL go down, so good cholesterol. You're going to see LDL increase as well. Now, within this, you have to weigh this against your baseline risk factors. Like, do you have comorbidities that are associated with hepatic function? Do you have any kind of dyslipidemia? And if you do, then we need to consider these very probable elevations, or, you know, in the case of HDL, decreases, and whether or not those effects are going to be more costly because of what you're bringing to the table. And if that's the case, that needs to be a discussion that you have with your coach. It needs to be something that you yourself consider. So for females, now the biggest risk for using Anavar for too long is virilization. And this is something that I've made tons of videos about so far. So, I mean, like, if you are confused, if you're like, hey, this is the first podcast I've seen, I just wanted to learn about Anavar, I don't know what virilization is. Virilization is the development of masculine characteristics. It's something that in some cases can be reversed. In many cases, it cannot be reversed. So when we're talking about specific changes in vocal pitch, deepening of the voice, thickening of the vocal cords, you can quite literally sound different. And that's one that you're not really going to see come back. So in the case that you have used Anavar for too long, or you've used it at a dose that is too high, you could very well experience changes to your voice, to how you sound. And sure, there are individuals who will say, well, you can go through speech therapy, you can get vocal training, potentially. But I wouldn't say for many people that they're going to be able to do much. And it's not something that I necessarily can say, oh yeah, just like go through 3 months. It's like, it doesn't really work that way. And there very much is a certain point where there is no point of return. Like you can't undo it. It's done. Now, the other irreversible effect of using Anavar for too long or for a dose that is too high is clitoral megaly. So growth of your clit. Yes. And that's something that some people are like, they kind of make light of it. I know a lot of men, they're like, well, it's easy to find. And like, oh, I like it this way, so it doesn't bother me. It's like, you as the individual, you, the person going through these changes, you have to decide if you're okay with that. And it's not something that across the board, everyone is going to have the same risk tolerance towards. There are going to be some people that are not bothered by clitoral megaly. They are very much okay with these changes. But you're not just looking at actual growth in size. You're also looking at increased sensitivity, which is something that I know a lot of clients have come to me from previous experiences. And they've said they're like, it has been so uncomfortable, and sexually this has now posed a problem for me. So it's not something I would necessarily take lightly. And I certainly would recommend, if that's something that you're already concerned about, I would just be very diligent that you understand the duration of use in which you and your coach are planning to use Anavar, and the dose that you're going to be using during that duration, which virilization, those are the two primary components that are irreversible, but we can't forget about suppression of gonadotropins. So FSH, LH, testosterone, we are going to see some degree of hormonal suppression while on Anavar. And you really have to consider, if the goal is to drive muscle growth, how does the suppression of gonadotropins, FSH, LH, how does that suppression impact your ability to build muscle? And if it does, what's the trade-off? Do you have the ability to incorporate something even temporarily like DHEA or TRT that ultimately would provide that kind of support while on cycle? But I think it's something that we need really a clear landscape of to begin with. We need to know where your baseline is hormonally. We also need to know what is the balance of estradiol to progesterone, and are you in a position where you're really able to get the most out of this drug? And if you put the drug in place, if these levels go down, is that ability, that capacity to build also going to go down as well?